We've got a fantastic panel here today on everybody's favourite topic, global regulation. We've only got 30 minutes, so we're going to stick to no questions from the audience unless I see someone particularly interesting that John's identified himself already. But we've got a fantastic panel here today to discuss this. If I ask everyone to introduce themselves, Isabella, if I start with you first.
Thanks so much, Lavan. And is that working?
I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Thanks so much, Lavan, and thank you to GBBC for inviting us here today. My name's Isabella Chase. I'm a senior policy advisor for TRM Labs. TRM is a blockchain intelligence company.
So I'm Cohn. I'm the co-chair of the blockchain and cryptocurrency practice at Steptoe and Johnson's law firm based in Washington, D.C. We've had we have a full-service practice in this space. We've had a practice since 2015, and then I came to Steptoe from the Department of Homeland Security before that in the U.S.
Teana?
I'm Teana Baker-Taylor, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Strategy for Circle in EMEA. And I have also been part of a number of regulatory advisory and advocacy organizations over the years as well.
And Shlomit.
Hi, my name is Shlomit Wagman. Great being here. Until recently, I was the Israeli regulator, the head of the Anti-Money Laundering Authority, including supervising the crypto scene, and also the co-chair at the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and took part in designing the global legislation on cryptocurrencies. Currently, I'm at Harvard University, visiting fellow and faculty associate at the Kennedy School and at the law school. Pleasure being here.
Super, and I think we can all agree that we've got a fantastic panel to deal with global regulatory approaches. But we can't talk about global regulatory approaches without addressing, first of all, the EU's markets and crypto asset regulation, which was concluded last year, due to come into the official journals in next month. So Teana, if I come over to you first to talk about that, what does this mean and what impact will it have?
So those who are not familiar with MiCA, it's pretty unique in the industry. It is a holistic end-to-end regulatory framework that pretty much covers most market actors, exclusive of NFTs and DeFi. And it will be rolled out across all 27 member states. So one of the key things that it solves for is the regulatory arbitrage between European countries. So I think that will be incredibly powerful. It also regulates trading platforms, and really across the globe, other than maybe Japan. I think it's the first kind of full-fat framework to bring into the purview things like consumer protection and market integrity. It also regulates stablecoins. So Circle's in the process of doing what we need to do to become MiCA compliant. And it really is the first of its kind. I think what we're seeing now is the potential. Did I lose my mic? The potential for other jurisdictions to potentially look at how they might either align to MiCA in some cases, or in a second mover advantage position, look at where they might increase their own competitiveness at a national level.
Absolutely, and I want to pick up on that later, and I'll come to other panelists as to how they see that. But Teana, if I stick with you here, and we look at the identifying the next steps. MiCA's in the official journals as of next month, but is that it, or do we have more to come?
So, is this on? Do I need to share it on? There I am. Hello. So what the process is that it needs to be voted in by the Parliament. Right now it's being translated into 27 potential different languages, so that takes some time. And then what will happen is the rulemaking process will begin. So what we now have is legislation, which compared with potentially American-style legislation, it's quite prescriptive. So there are a number of things that potentially could be further interpreted, but a lot of MiCA is quite, like the ink is dry. Some of those factors relate to how
market actors will be supervised, predominantly like who will supervise which activity. So it brings into account the national regulator, the home regulator, and then potentially regional regulators like potentially ESMA or the EBA in some cases.
Absolutely, and I think that's the interesting point there. We've got to the point of that agreement, but there's still a long way to go, despite this coming into the official journals. But it does put pressure, as Teana was saying, on other jurisdictions to follow suit, either to be close follower or look to differentiate themselves. And certainly from the UK perspective, there is that pressure. Isabella, if I come over to you now, what is the approach that the UK is taking? Are they going to be close follower or are they going to diverge?
That is a great question. I think we are yet to know for certain the extent of that potential divergence. I think UK policymakers are under some pressure from the government and senior policymakers to bring about some form of difference, some form of divergence to show the benefits of the whole Brexit process that has swamped UK policymaking for a good couple of years. What that will look like will be interesting. I think from what we've heard is that there is a desire to be slightly more dynamic than MiCA. I mean, Teana used to use the words very prescriptive. So the UK, I think, will want to be a little bit more, dynamic, risk-based than what we have seen. But of course, to remain attractive and what we tend to see in the UK market, people want to also operate in the EU market. There has to be some level of alignment so that you can easily have your MiCA license and then also transport something similar in the UK. But 2023 is going to be a big year for the UK. We'll see 2 very significant consultations released in the coming weeks that will go on and set out the UK's response to MiCA. So we're all waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, there's a lot of cut and paste too.
Yeah.
I think those are like, when you look at MiCA, there's definitely tenets of MiFID that are familiar within the UK. I think there's definitely a desire to kind of draw from existing frameworks like the FMI, for example, for financial market infrastructure. I'm hoping that it will indeed be dynamic. But, as the current bill that's moving through Parliament, I don't know if you agree, but some of the things that I think enabled government to have a little bit more leverage with the regulator to be more competitive are slowly kind of being stripped away. And that, I think I'm a little concerned about that.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing. Last year at the Innovate Finance Global Summit, that was when John Glenn, who was then Economic Secretary to the Treasury, used those words. He said our regulation has got to be dynamic, not static, and kind of likened it to code, being able to adapt to how the technology and the industry develops. And I think that is very important. I think, Teana, you mentioned a really good point there about this copy and paste. Yes, I mean, even when you look at markets and crypto assets, and it sounds very similar to markets in financial instruments. And then when we look at what the UK have done so far in expanding the regulatory perimeter of the e-money directive to cover certain stablecoins, it does look like it's an existing regulatory approach first. But I guess there also has to be this consistency in terms of approach. You can't have this two-speed approach as much as many of us would like a bespoke regime to apply to crypto assets. But Alan, if I come over to you next, I mean, from the US, there are a number of discussions that are taking place there, and one of the overriding ones seems to be a land grab between the CFTC and the SEC. And to what extent is that an important battle to be won before we can see a kind of more comprehensive framework and a kind of a national regime coming through?
Well, I mean, hopefully that's not going to be the central theme, but unfortunately it definitely takes a lot of airspace. It's worth remembering that there are other regulators in the US besides those two, and that there is a regulatory frame that that it has emerged in the US. But as you said, not wanting bespoke regulatory regimes and such, the US is generally less concerned about how does it fit with the rest of the world and more concerned about first what does it want and then can it get the rest of the world to do the same thing. In the US, anti-money laundering regulation, economic sanctions requirements, tax rules are actually emerging and coming along. This debate between the securities regulator and the commodities regulator has introduced this question of jurisdiction and this jurisdictional battle into what ideally would be more of a substantive debate over what is the proper way to regulate different types and categories of digital assets in a manner that protects markets, protects investors, protects consumers. And so that's getting drowned out a bit. It may, however, become something of a sideshow depending on whether other regulators in the United States or Congress sees fit to say, look, we need something more comprehensive and broad. And I think you may see in the United States the Treasury Department start to assert kind of a more overarching perspective as they are making indications that they want to do, for example, in the area of stablecoins, to say, let's try to take this out of the domain of securities versus commodities, and let's say this is a category of assets that require regulation in the same way that we provide regulatory oversight, governance, and prudential supervision to different types of actors in this space that handle, or even in this case issue, certain types of assets. So you'll certainly hear a lot about the SEC and the CFTC, and that's exacerbated by the fact that unlike FinCEN, our anti-money laundering regulator, unlike now more recently OFAC, our Office of Foreign Asset Control, our economic sanctions regulator, who's gotten much better about issuing guidance and frequently asked questions, and the IRS and our tax authority, which has had a pretty consistent stance on cryptocurrency since 2014. There are definitely edge cases and gray areas, but foundationally they've been consistent. You know, it's exacerbated by the fact that not only is there this jurisdictional tug of war going on between the SEC and the CFTC, but both of these independent regulators have struggled to move beyond the enforcement stance, and what you could characterize as regulation by enforcement, trying to bring individual enforcement actions, and have the industry draw conclusions from the results in those actions, rather than putting out the kind of guidance, whether it's formal rulemaking, whether it's informal guidance, frequently asked questions, other type exemptive rulings, that the industry would really benefit from, the entire ecosystem would benefit from, if those two agencies, the SEC in particular, would take some of the things that they obviously think around lending, with respect to BlockFi now, with respect to Gemini and Genesis, where they have a defined position, but they're still using the enforcement tool rather than using their rulemaking or other types of guidance mechanisms to provide real left and right boundaries for industry players that are consistent for everyone.
But why do you think that is? Why are they taking that enforcement position as opposed to putting out that guidance?
I mean, if one wanted to be cynical, it's easier. It's more straightforward. It's easier. You pick your targets. You pick your where you want to engage, and you get a benefit of the doubt when you go into court that your entering position is sound until it's disproven, you know, regardless of what the standards of proof are. But unfortunately, it's not really durable, obviously, and it raises questions about, you know, the consistency of why target this entity over that entity. Are there material differences between one protocol and another protocol, one type of entity versus another entity, one type of action versus another action, you know, where I think the SEC wants to be able to paint with a relatively broad brush. I think for industry participants, there are material differences in the ways that things work. There's definitely a spectrum of centralization versus decentralization, which is a concept that, for example, the SEC has spoken a lot about, but really doesn't appear anywhere in the relevant statutes
think-
and relevant guidance.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing, because one thing that you want from regulation is to provide that clarity, and this regulation by enforcement does not provide that. One of the things I think to bear in mind with creating these guidelines and these rules, it's very much an infrastructure project, because it takes a long time to be able to develop these to make sure they're sound and fit for purpose across the board. And we need to bear in mind that the conversation around MiCA, we identified that in 2014, and by the time it enters into force, it will be 2024, so 10 years on. So it takes time to do that. So I think that's important to bear in mind. One of the other things, Alan, you'd mentioned, and I'm interested to bring in Shlomit on this, is that what happens on an international agenda perspective. Now, I know, Shlomit, you did a lot of the work with the FATF travel rule, and I think this is one of those examples where it has worked. This is a global technology. We need a global response and a global rule book for how this is operating. And the travel rule was a fantastic example of that. Why is it that it worked there?
Thank you so much. So I think that it is a global story, and we've seen certain approaches of major players, but I would like to suggest the overview of the global overview on how international regulation is approaching a new phenomena, the blockchain technologies. And we could say that there are about 5 main buckets of regulation that are relevant to blockchain and cryptocurrencies. First, it's financial crime, money laundering, terrorism financing, sanction evasion. Then we have consumer and investor protection, SEC regulation. Third is taxes. 4, privacy, GDPR, data protection, and 5th is financial stability, and we could add also the 6th dimension, which is cybersecurity. Now, what's interesting is that the international community started with the most pressure problem, which is financial crime. And on that aspect, there is a very strong international organization, the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, who took action and already in 2018 imposed international standards to combat money laundering, terrorism financing, financial crime, because without doing that, there are many holes in the bucket, and the industry will not be able to continue working and may interfere with traditional financing in a way that poses some threat to its integrity. So at the Financial Action Task Force, what we did, we designed a framework that all countries must adopt. It's not a matter of consideration. They have to do that. Now, it's first thing is to actually require country to do licensing regime on a virtual asset service provider to define those terms, and then to actually impose the entire AML and CFT regulation on cryptocurrencies. That was not an easy step, but once it has been decided and already concluded about 4 years ago already, all countries must impose that, and part of it is the travel rule. Now, it also requires countries to get ready for that. And law enforcement authorities, like my authority, has to create the capabilities and expertise in order to deal with this environment. Now, it takes time, but in 4 years, we have more than 100 countries already adopting the entire regime. MiCA is also an implementation of that. The UK, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, like 100 countries are already there. And we will see the rest of the country doing that very soon, because otherwise they will be subject to sanctions. Now, what can we learn from that? I think that we'll see, we should hope to see a similar trend in securities, protection, consumer and investor protection as well. Currently, and especially the situation in the US is extremely confusing. I hate to say that, but no one other than the US cares whether this is commodities or securities. It's just, we should just impose the same traditional rules to those environments with the needed adjustments. So MiCA does it to some extent, but the work does not end there. It is necessary to have a global approach, unified approach to target that. And in addition, we also need to look at the next challenges, which is DeFi, NFTs, and so forth. And here again, we already see that the FATF is in the front line and is starting to think about those issues and actually saying, just a hint to those who are interested in that, that DeFi is subject to the same framework as virtual asset service providers, because many times in the current DeFi sector, it is very centralized, and there are entities and intermediaries who has the ability to control that or to manage that to some extent if they wish to do that, and so forth. But that's an example on how we are keeping developing and updating that, and a global approach is, of course, on this.
Can I add one thing to that? I mean, I'm FATF's biggest fan, and all the requirements and the way that they've amended. I don't know if you're laughing, Teana, but you know it's true. Well, I stand by it. Like, I'm a big fan of that organisation. But I think it's really important to learn from, yes, we've had 100 plus countries adopt, but we've only had 11 enforce. And so we can't really say it's been implemented because it hasn't. And I think we learn a really, really good lesson about here is a global framework for something, anti-financial crime. But let's see what were some of those implementation challenges. I think what we learned very early on was that you need to bring the private sector into that regulatory conversation to build the technical solutions to implement the global framework, because that was a huge headache that we're getting over now. But it was something that we probably should have foreseen during the design of the regulation. So I think it's about, we learned, bring private sector in early to build technical solutions, and then we need to share best practices as soon as possible, and then people need to come in to help others. So we see in the US request for comment for the responsible asset framework, the US asking, which are the countries around the world that need help to do this better, and where are the weak points? Where should we go to and prioritize our capacity building? And I think that's kind of, when we look at the other 4 areas of global frameworks, we need to learn those lessons and take them forwards.
I'd agree with that. I think that when we think about money laundering or preventing financial crime, I think that's something that everybody around the world can get on board with, right? Nobody wants to be part of perpetuating criminal activity or human trafficking or any of those horrible things. And indeed, there was an organization that was set up to combat financial crime. And so the areas, or the ability to harmonize across that area, I think had a foundational kind of layer already set. However, having said that, I agree that putting something down on paper and then saying, okay, everybody do this, when a technical solution didn't exist, I think was a real rally cry to the industry. And the industry did develop technical solutions. So when we look across frameworks like MiCA, a lot of these things sound great on paper, but in practicality, I think are going to be very difficult to rule make for, more difficult to supervise, and maybe even impossible to enforce. And so when you look at that review period, which is 24 months later, 24 months is a long time. So if you stand back and look through that lens into the UK or the US, you can kind of see where maybe being in a second mover position has some significant advantages around seeing what works and what doesn't. And in some of these areas, I have a lot of concern around, we talk a lot at Circle about kind of digitizing, internet-ready flow of value around the world. And if value can't flow around the world and it gets stuck in one region, and then, does Europe create this little nook for itself where it's cut off from the rest of the globe? And I think that's a potential to happen. So I do think in both of these cases, we have some big, robust frameworks that have yet to be proven, and maybe we should be mindful about, taking in some commentary a little earlier on.
The last thing I would add.
Sorry, Shlomit and then Alan.
May I just jump on the role of the private sector in the process? As was mentioned, actually the FATF conducted the entire process with the private sector, and on purpose left the travel rule to a later stage because we didn't know how to create that, and we let the industry to create the standards over there, and this is the part which is mainly still missing. But I do want to throw here in the room, in probably the private sector, actually the next challenge There's a lot of compliance challenges to solve. Take the lead on that. How to actually create a technological solution, because this is a technological environment. This is not cash. There are so many excellent solutions that the industry can set as standards. For example, how to create transparency to law enforcement authorities while preserving privacy of the client. We have zero knowledge proof and so many additional technologies that regulators are not fully aware of the options that are out there. And I think that that's the role here, to actually create those environments that preserve the values that the community wants to preserve, while actually allowing better compliance and regulation and toolbox for regulators to adopt.
I just want to add one other thing about the FATF process. And it's not to say that the U.S. is the most important or only important jurisdiction in the world, but it's important to remember that in that particular instance, the U.S. has one regulator whose responsibility the FATF issues falls under, and that regulator, the FinCEN, had what was being brought into the FATF guidance set was what the U.S. had already done in large account. And so it's just a note of caution to say that trying to replicate that approach for areas where the U.S. has multiple regulators. For example, you talked about the SEC. The SEC's writ is market integrity and investor protection. It doesn't include consumer protection. It doesn't include cybersecurity. Those invoke the jurisdictions of others. Yeah. So I just would say that as a note of caution when thinking about, the U.S.'s role in these processes. That was a place where, in many ways, that process was starting from where the U.S. already was.
I'm being given the cut it signal from Diana over here, so I think we've run out of time. But just to wrap up very quickly, one of the themes that I think we started to establish towards the end, which I think is really important and fitting towards next steps through global regulation, which you struggle to read that, but is the need for industry engagement. And to quote what Matthew Long, who chairs the IOSCO Task Force on Crypto Assets, told Isabella and I in one of the meetings, it's time for the industry to not say this won't work, but come forward with credible solutions as to how it will work. And that's why it's important for us to coalesce, get together and present that to the relevant bodies. And I think that's what the outlook for regulation looks like. Thank you very much to my panelists, Shlomit, Teana, Alan and Isabella, and enjoy the rest of the day.